Hello, and welcome to the recorded version of the State Fiscal Year 24 Victims of Crime Act VOCA application training. My name is Jean Booth, and I will be presenting this training. Here's the quick agenda of the topics we will be reviewing in today's webinar. The purpose of this webinar is to familiarize potential Victims of Crime Act Assistance Program subrecipients with the VOCA grant. The topics that are reviewed are based on previously asked questions, so if there are any topics covered that you would like more detail on, or any topics that were not covered that you would like clarification on, please let us know so we can improve this presentation. What is VOCA? The Victims of Crime Act, or VOCA, was passed by Congress in 1984. The Crime Victims Fund was established and is generated from fines and penalties paid by convicted federal offenders, not tax dollars. On July 22, 2021, President Biden signed the VOCA Fix to Sustain Crime Victims Fund Act of 2021. What does this mean for VOCA? This means that Congress required monetary penalties from federal deferred prosecution and non-prosecution agreements to go into the Crime Victims Fund. It provided the Attorney General with the authority to provide no-cost extensions to all VOCA award recipients. It allowed state VOCA administrators to waive or requires them to waive subgrantee match requirements. Increased the federal grant calculation for funding to victim compensation programs to 75% of state-funded payouts. Following the signing, OVC, or the Office of Victims of Crime, recalculated the fiscal year 2021 formula allocations, issued 3 bulletins clarifying the match waiver, law enforcement cooperation exemption, and community violence intervention support, and they began tracking receipts from federal deferred prosecution and non-prosecution agreements. The Crime Victims Fund is distributed by the Office of Victims of Crime through the Department of Justice. The VOCA Assistance Program funding is available for states to fund and facilitate the development of programs to provide direct services to victims of crime. The goal of the VOCA Assistance Program in Nevada is to promote and support quality victim services programs across the state. The Division of Child and Family Services, or DCFS, within the state of Nevada, DHHS, is the state administering agency that administers VOCA funding to subrecipients. The role of DCFS is to ensure that subrecipients are eligible to receive VOCA funding and have the organizational capacity to effectively administer the VOCA funding while maintaining quality and compliance standards and are abiding by state and federal rules and regulations. $15 million available funds, Nevada has chosen to allocate VOCA funding based on the following geographic distribution percentages: 69% to Clark County, 19% to Washoe County, and 12% to rural counties, based off the information found in the 2022 VOCA Needs Assessment. This geographic distribution allows for direct services for victims to be provided in both urban areas with larger populations and allows for funding to also be made available to victims in smaller communities in rural areas. The federal mandate for VOCA requires Nevada to allocate at least 10% of each year's VOCA grant to victims of domestic violence, sexual assault, child abuse, and underserved population. VOCA funding priority is given to programs that serve victims of sexual assault, domestic violence, child abuse, and underserved victims. For sexual assault, services provided should assist victims in dealing with the trauma of sexual assault and its emotional aftermath. Services may include 24-hour crisis hotlines, crisis intervention, emergency services, legal advocacy, clinical evaluation, and long and short-term counseling. Services may be provided to the victim's family and significant others. Services must be designed to serve both male and female victims. These services may be provided to adult survivors of child sexual abuse or incest. For domestic violence, services to victims and their children may include 24-hour crisis hotlines, crisis intervention, emergency services, shelters or safe homes, long and short-term counseling, information and referral, and legal advocacy in obtaining emergency restraining orders, injunctive or other protective orders. For child abuse, these services should include treatment for children who are victims of physical or sexual abuse and their non-offending parents and siblings. Examples of services may include play, individual, and/or group therapy. Services may be provided through mental health or hospital-based programs. For underserved priority areas and underserved victim populations, Nevada recognizes children and minors, immigrants, elderly, people with disabilities, LGBTQIA2+, tribal communities, and the homeless. The current allocation is based on the findings from the 2022 needs assessment. The amount of funding available by geographic distribution and priority areas considers all the different types of victim service needs, while also fostering innovation and helping to build capacity for agencies providing direct services to victims across the state. On Transforming Victim Services final report can be found at ojp.gov. It provides information on the history of victim services in the United States and details the challenges and innovative practices that have been successful on improving victim services. The report also contains information on the OJP's website, www.crimesolutions.gov, which is on this slide, that disseminates evidence-based practice that can be adapted for use by state and local practitioners. While DCFS is not focusing on innovative programs this year, we do encourage agencies to think outside the box and to think of innovative ways to provide services to victims. Eligible subrecipients are those agencies that provide direct services to victims of crime and demonstrate the capacity to serve victims while maintaining compliance with state and federal rules and regulations. Agencies must comply with DCFS and VOCA grant requirements. They must comply with federal rules regulating VOCA assistance grants, maintain statutorily required civil rights statistics on victims served by complying with civil rights requirements contained in various federal laws, demonstrate community collaboration with other victim service providers and community agencies, maintain confidentiality of client counselor information as required by state and federal law, ensuring the confidentiality of information provided by crime victims to counselors working for victim service programs receiving VOCA funds. Help victims apply for the Victims of Crime Compensation Program or VOCA comp benefits. Have policies and procedures to safeguard the confidentiality of all victim personally identifiable information or PII. And they must not charge victims for VOCA-funded services. Eligible subrecipients must meet program match requirements, which for VOCA is 20% of the total subaward, unless the potential subrecipient is a federally recognized tribe or a tribal organization operating on tribal land. Eligible subrecipients provide direct services to victims of crime and have demonstrated effectiveness in serving the victims in their community. Eligible subrecipients utilize volunteers and can demonstrate that at least 25% of the program's funding in the year of or the year preceding the award comes from other funding sources, which may include other federal funding programs. Cultural competency is very important to take into account for agencies administering VOCA funding. Victims of crime can be from diverse geographic, ethnic, racial, cultural, economic, social, and linguistic backgrounds. In order to adequately serve all victims of crime, it is important to address potential cultural barriers, stereotyping, value differences, communication styles, and language and interpreter bias with an organization. In order to properly train and prepare victim advocates to provide effective service delivery and ensure the needs of the victims are met. We're going to talk for a second about collaboration. VOCA eligible subrecipients will demonstrate collaboration with other victim service providers and other community providers. Collaboration with other victim service providers will eliminate the overlap in payments and services in your area. Eligible subrecipients should be able to describe their agency's sustainability plan outside of VOCA funding, including diverse funding resources, staff commitments, and longevity of the organization. Sustainability should show less reliance on VOCA funding. According to the National Council of Nonprofits, a nonprofit financial sustainability plan is a plan that allows a nonprofit to sustain itself over the long term so that it is able to continue to support its mission. Shrinking budgets at state, national, and municipal levels means there's less to go around. Most agencies end up getting less funding than they want or that they need, while some are left with no funding at all. Having a steady income from any source is hard, and that can make budgeting a real challenge. What are ways to make an organization sustainable? Team building efforts, diversify fundraising, rigorous marketing, and adopting technical solutions. VOCA funding is available for the purpose of providing direct services to victims of crime. Subrecipients must provide services to victims of federal crimes on the same basis as to victims of crimes under state or local law. Switching gears now, here's a list of VOCA allowable direct service costs. Immediate emotional, psychological, and physical health and safety, which includes shelter. Personal advocacy and emotional support, mental health counseling and care, peer support, facilitation of participation in criminal justice and other public proceedings arising from the crime, legal assistance, forensic medical evidence collection examinations, forensic interviews, transportation, public awareness, transitional housing, and relocation. The allowable costs for activities supporting direct services are coordination of activities, supervision of direct service providers, multi-system, interagency, multidisciplinary response to crime victim needs, contracts for professional services, automated systems and technology, volunteer trainings, and restorative justice. Here's a list of the allowable subrecipient administrative costs. These include things like skills training for staff. VOCA's funds designated for training are to be used exclusively for developing the skills of direct service providers, including paid staff and volunteers, so that they are better able to offer quality services to crime victims. An example of skills development is training focused on how to respond to a victim in crisis. VOCA funds cannot be used for management and administrative training for executive directors, board members, and other individuals that do not provide direct services. Training materials. VOCA funds can be used to purchase materials such as books, training manuals, and videos for direct service providers within the VOCA-funded organization and can support the costs of a trainer for in-service staff development. Staff from other organizations can attend in-service training activities that are held for the subrecipient staff. Training-related travel. VOCA funds can support costs such as travel, meals, lodging, and registration fees to attend training within the state or a similar geographic area. This limitation encourages subrecipients to first look for available training within their immediate geographical area, as travel costs will be minimal. Equipment and furniture. VOCA funds cannot support the entire cost of an item that is not used exclusively for victim-related activities. However, VOCA funds can support a prorated share of such an item. In addition, subrecipients cannot use VOCA funds to purchase equipment for another organization or individual to perform a victim-related service. Examples of allowable costs may include beepers, typewriters, and word processors, video cameras and players for interviewing children, two-way mirrors, and equipment and furniture for shelters, workspaces, victim waiting rooms, and the children's play areas. The cost of furniture, equipment such as Braille equipment or FFY-TTD machines for the deaf or minor building alterations and improvements that make a victim's service more accessible to persons with disabilities are allowable. Subrecipients must refer to the 2015 OJP Financial Guide, which can be accessed at https://financialguide/doj/index.htm, and discuss with DCFS before these types of decisions are made. Contracts for professional services. VOCA funds generally should not be used to support contract services. At times, however, it may be necessary for VOCA subrecipients to use a portion of the VOCA award to contract for specialized services. Subrecipients are prohibited from using a majority of VOCA funds for contracted services, which can already contain administrative, overhead, and other indirect costs included in the hourly or daily rate. Operating costs. Examples of allowable operating costs include supplies, equipment use fees, when supported by usage logs, printing, photocopying, and postage, brochures which describe available services, and books and other victim-related materials. Repair and/or replacement of essential items. VOCA funds may be used for repair or replacement of items that contribute to maintaining a healthy and/or safe environment for crime victims, such as a furnace in a shelter. Public presentations. VOCA funds may be used to support presentations that are made in schools, community centers, or other public forums, and that are designed to help identify crime victims and provide or refer them to needed services. Specifically, activities and costs related to such programs, including presentation materials, brochures, and newspaper notices, can be supported by VOCA funds. Due to the recent VOCA funding cuts, DCFS has determined that the main point of focus for state fiscal year 24 funding will be for direct victim services. Exceptional justification and cost allocation must be provided for any supportive or administrative services to be considered. Here's some clarification on emergency shelter. VOCA funds may be used to pay for hotel accommodations for victims while a shelter is out of service or unavailable, and are costs associated with immediate emotional, psychological, and physical health and safety of victims. When VOCA is talking about the physical health of the victim, they're not talking about the physical mental health. They're talking about the basic human physical need to be safe, warm, dry, and protected. VOCA cannot reimburse for medical bills. Regarding direct services for personal advocacy and emotional support, here's a list of personal advocacy and emotional support services that would be allowable under VOCA. Number 1, working with a victim to assess the impact of a crime. 2, identification of a victim's needs. 3, case management. 4, management of a practical problems created by the victimization. 5, identification of resources available to the victim. 6, provision of information, referrals, advocacy, and follow-up contact for continued services as needed. 7, traditional, cultural, and/or alternative therapy or healing. Alternative therapy must have proven documented benefits to a victim recovery. Restorative justice activities support opportunities for crime victims to meet with perpetrators. Victims must always have the opportunity to withdraw. DCFS has discretion to determine what restorative justice activities will be funded under VOCA. In a nutshell, here's an overview list of all the allowable costs categories just reviewed. VOCA funds may include, but are not limited to, use in the following: coordination of activities, supervision of direct service providers, multi-system, interagency, multidisciplinary response to crime victim needs, contracts for professional services, automated systems and technology, volunteer trainings, and restorative justice. Here's a list of unallowable costs under VOCA. Lobbying and administrative advocacy. VOCA funds cannot support victim legislation or administration reform, whether conducted directly or indirectly. Perpetrator rehabilitation and counseling. Subrecipients cannot knowingly use VOCA funds to offer rehabilitative services to offenders. Needs assessments, surveys, evaluations, and studies. VOCA funds may not be used to pay for efforts conducted by individuals, organizations, task force, or special commissions to study and/or research particular crime victim issues. Prosecution activities. VOCA funds cannot be used to pay for activities that are directed at prosecuting an offender and/or improving the criminal justice system's effectiveness and efficiency, such as witness notification and management activities and expert testimony at a trial. In addition, victim witness protection costs and subsequent lodging and meal expenses are considered part of the criminal justice agency's responsibility and cannot be supported with VOCA funds. VOCA prohibits using funds for criminal defense and tort lawsuits. Fundraising activities. VOCA funds cannot pay for any activities related to fundraising. Capital expenses. The cost of liability insurance on buildings, capital improvements, property losses and expenses, real estate purchases, mortgage payments, and construction may not be supported with VOCA funds. Property loss. Reimbursing crime victims for expenses incurred as a result of a crime, such as insurance deductibles, replacement of stolen property, funeral expenses, lost wages, and medical bills, is not allowed. Please assist crime victims in completing the victim's compensation form and refer them to the Victim Compensation Office. Most medical costs. VOCA funds cannot pay for nursing home care, home health care costs, inpatient treatment, hospital care, and other types of emergency and non-emergency medical and/or dental treatment. VOCA funds cannot support medical costs resulting from victimization. Relocation expenses. VOCA funds cannot support relocation expenses for crime victims, such as ongoing rent and mortgage payments. Administrative staff expenses. Salaries, fees, and reimbursable expenses associated with administrators, board members, executive directors, consultants, coordinators, and other individuals, unless these expenses are incurred while providing direct services to crime victims. These are allowable only in the indirect category of the budget narrative. Development of protocols, interagency agreements, and other working agreements. These activities benefit crime victims, but they are considered examples of the type of activities that subrecipients undertake as part of their role as a victim service organization. Cost of sending individual crime victims to conferences is not allowed. Activities exclusively related to crime prevention is not allowed with VOCA. All right, we're going to talk a little bit about the application materials. We have 8 sections: the application checklist, application form, proposal narrative, scope of work, budget, agency self-assessment, past performance with DCFS GMU, and attachments. The application checklist does not need to be submitted. It is a tool to assist you with this grant application. This is what the checklist looks like. It'll be the first page on your application packet. The application form is one document with application form, 0 points and it must be completed. It's worth 0 points, it must be completed. The scope of work is 15 points. The proposed project budget is 50 points. And we'll go over all of those during this presentation. Give me just 1 second and I will share the application form with you all. Okay, so this is what the application form looks like. All of the cells must be completed to be a complete application. So when you reach your victim populations to be served, you're going to specify the percentage of funding requested for services by population or client. You're going to choose only services that are specific to a federal priority category, and all services not specific to the federal priority category should include all other victims of crime category. So when you're looking at your agency, you're really going to want to make sure to figure out, are you primarily a child abuse agency, domestic violence agency, or sexual assault agency? If you have percentage of funding in all 3, that's fine. Just put the total percent of funding. But you want to be as accurate as possible so we can make sure that our total allocation is correct for each of our allocation areas. On the funding request, you're going to put, if you received a state fiscal year 23 award, how much you received, and then you're going to put in the state fiscal year 24 request. And please make sure to enter in the difference. If you're requesting more funding on this application than you received for state fiscal year 23, You must briefly describe how the increased funding will be used. Due to declining funds, any increase will need to have exceptional justification provided to be considered. Explain a very brief summary of the purpose of your request. Think of this as what would be on the back of a book blurb. We would need a program point of contact and a fiscal officer point of contact information. If you do subcontracting, this is different than contractors. This is like a subrecipient kind of thing. You're going to want to also list your contracts, but your contracts are definitely going to want to put on your budget narrative more than on right here. List all your current funding information. We'll need to know that information, and then the key personnel name and title. Make sure you read what you're certifying and have an authorized signatory sign and date your application. We're going to talk very briefly about the proposal narrative. There are, I believe, 8 questions to this. Make sure you read the overview and what's in each question. There are a maximum amount of characters on each question, so make sure that you keep that in mind when you're answering these. We have a statement of need, services proposed, goals and objectives, availability and accessibility of services, community coordination and collaboration. This is a little bit different from any previous applications that we've had. You're going to want to check the box on which agent or which organization that you've collaborated with in your region, and this needs to be a current collaboration, not something you did like 10 years ago. And then make sure to answer if there is a question at the end. So for example, other victim service agencies, which one? There's a line there so that you can enter in the information on which other victim service agencies that you collaborate with. We're going to talk about vicarious trauma and what your agency does for that. And finally, we're going to talk about sustainability. You're going to describe your agency's sustainability plan outside of VOCA funding that supports sustainability, including diverse funding resources, staff commitments, and longevity of the organization. So that is the proposal narrative. And let's get back to our slides. Sorry. Okay. So we did just talk about the proposal narrative, and that is section 2, and that's worth 115 points. Now we're going to talk a little bit about the scope of work. The purpose of the scope of work is to provide a clear and concise description of the services that will be provided with grant funding. This is not a copy and paste from your narrative. This is a clear and concise description of your services. This will assist the Grant Evaluation Committee to understand how an agency is planning on using the funding, if awarded, in an easy, at-a-glance format. It has measurable deliverables so that the grant management unit staff can objectively measure if the program met its goals. And it's going to connect the budget narrative to the goals and objectives. The first page of the scope of work is the instruction page. The second page has definitions and an example. The third page is the page that you will complete and submit for your scope of work. While the third page is the only one you are going to work on, it is important for all agencies to read, review, and understand the first 2 pages to properly complete the third one. The scope of work has a lot of instructions on it and has a measurable target number section. The third page is the only one that is needed to submit with your application. We do not need the instructions or the example. Your state fiscal year 24 budget narrative. I apologize, there's a typo on this page. It's an Excel workbook with 3 tabs. You must fill out all 3 tabs. The tabs are budget narrative, budget summary, and your match budget narrative. Budget narrative for personnel. These are for employees who provide direct services The NOFO has a table to help you distinguish between an employee and contract staff. You're going to list each position and employee name if known. Provide a breakdown of the wages or salary and the fringe benefit rate. You're going to make sure to put a brief job description and explain how that position provides direct services. Only those staff whose time can be traced directly back to the grant project should be included in this budget category. All other staff should be considered part of the applicant's indirect costs. This is what your budget narrative Form 1 personnel section will look like. Please remember to put your agency name at the top. Enter the name of the employee or TBD if unknown. You're going to enter the position. Enter the time in the position. Enter the information on the position and how it pertains to direct victim services. Please make sure that this is brief. You're going to enter the annual salary, fringe rate, percent of time, how many months you want or need the funding for, and the amount requested section will automatically populate. Okay. Your travel training section, travel costs must provide direct benefit to this project. You're going to identify the staff that will travel, the purpose, frequency, projected costs. You cannot exceed the U.S. General Services Administration or GSA rates. For training, identify and justify any training costs specifically associated with this project. Include the type of training, location, number attending, and benefit to the project. Please keep in mind that outside of the mileage for providing direct client services, anything in the travel training section must have exceptional justification and cost allocation to be considered. To complete your budget narrative form on travel training, you're going to enter the total cost of gas or mileage here. And then you're going to provide justification for expenses here. This should include how the mileage pertains to direct client services. Examples are included in the justification description. You're going to enter information about the agency vehicle here. The justification needs to tie into direct client services and be cost allocated across funding sources. Entering the information of other funding sources here is required. If travel training is being requested, the information must be entered in the respective categories. Exceptional justification and cost allocation must be provided to be considered. Please remember to provide justification on how your operating expenses tie into direct victim services. Operating costs are costs associated with the operation of providing direct services to victims. You're going to list and justify tangible and expendable property. Utilities, rent, and general supplies do not need to be priced individually, but a list of typical program supplies is necessary. Expenses in this section must have a direct victim service justification and show cost allocation to be considered. This is an example of what your operating section looks like on your budget. For your equipment, you must list equipment to purchase or lease costing of $5,000 or more and justify these expenditures. You're going to list any electronics regardless of cost. Equipment that does not directly facilitate the purpose of the project as an integral component is not allowed. Equipment purchased for this project must be labeled, inventoried, and tracked as such. This section is self-explanatory. This is your equipment section. You're going to describe the equipment to be purchased, such as a computer, cell phone, furniture, or other equipment, and how they tie into direct victim services. You're going to enter the cost. And then you're going to keep in mind that anything in the equipment section must have exceptional justification and cost allocation to be considered. Your contractual or consultant services, these are project workers who are not employees of the applicant organization and should be identified here. Any costs associated with these workers should be included. You're going to explain the need and/or purpose. Identify and justify these costs. Any method of selection should be competitive or sole source. Sole source needs detailed justification. We will discuss these further in a couple of slides. A copy of written agreements with all partners must be provided with your application. This is an example of your contractual consultant section on your budget narrative. You're going to enter the name of the contractor. Oh, I didn't make the little slidey things. Sorry. So you're going to enter the name of the contractor. You're going to explain the selection process. You're going to enter the contract performance period and then describe the scope of work and how it pertains to direct victim services. You're going to define the justification, explain why it is sole source or what your agency's contract process is. And then you're going to put the entire contract amount here and discuss your cost allocation. We will discuss the difference between sole source and contract on the next slide. Explain how the contractor is being held accountable with your agency. Please keep in mind that anything in the contract consultant section must have exceptional justification and cost allocation to be considered. Sole source versus contract. Sole source is only one supplier to the best of your knowledge and belief based on thorough research and can provide the required product or service. It's a method of acquisition. Steps taken to determine that no other providers exist must be provided. Requests for bids must be documented. A contract is a person or a company that undertakes a contract to provide materials or labor to perform a service or job. You must have a minimum of 3 quotes documented, and your office's procurement policies must be followed. We're going to talk about the budget narrative, your other expenses. This is the section where direct client services should be entered. All of these expenses directly affect the victim in some way. These are going to cover your shelter costs, such as beds, cleaning supplies, counseling, advocacy, crisis intervention services, and safety planning. Emergency client needs, such as food gift cards, clothing, hygiene supplies, gas cards, or emergency transportation. Or programmatic costs, brochures, flyers, public presentation, and any volunteer appreciation. Please remember that volunteer appreciation is not to exceed $25 per volunteer per year. This is your emergency client services needs to be explained if not already listed. For your indirect costs represent the expenses of doing business that are not readily identified with they're not readily identified with or allowable to a specific grant, contract, project function, or activity, but are necessary for the general operation of the organization. Subrecipients without a negotiated indirect rate with their cognizant federal agency may use a 10% de minimis rate. Subrecipients that have a current federally approved indirect cost rate with their federal cognizant agency must include a copy of that negotiated indirect agreement with your application. You must identify your indirect costs. Indirect rate is 10% of the modified total direct costs, or the MTDC. The MTDC means all direct salaries and wages, applicable fringe benefits, materials and supplies, services, travel, and up to the first $25,000 of contractual. MTDC does not include equipment, capital expenditures, charges for patient care, rental costs, tuition remission, scholarships and fellowships, participant support costs, and the portion of contracts in excess of $25,000. The total modified total direct cost should be entered here. This includes information found in the description here. So if you're going to use the 10% de minimis, which is 10% of the modified direct total cost, or the MTDC, please note that you have to include the correct formula. So MTDC is personnel, travel, operating, and the first 25,000 of contract only. You're going to enter that number in this section if requesting indirect. The total will automatically calculate the allowable 10% de minimis. If you have a federally approved indirect cost letter, you can enter that information here, and please make sure to attach your federally negotiated indirect cost letter. So Form 2, this is the most commonly skipped form in this entire application process. This is your budget summary. Column B should automatically update with the totals from Form 1. You're going to complete column C through G for all other funding sources for this project. Don't forget to include an explanation of any funding source you list as pending. Match column should automatically update once you've completed Form 3. This is a very important part of the application. You will lose points if it is not completed. This award and match columns will autofill from Forms 1 and 3. Make sure to add all the other funding. This is what's missed almost every single time we have an application process. You're going to mention if the funding is pending or secured. And then you're going to mention what type of funding it is, whether it's federal, state, private, or other type of funding. We need to know for our reporting if it is federal, state, or private funding. You can add more columns if you have more funding sources than the room has for. Please contact our team if you need technical assistance with this form. Your budget narrative Form 3, this looks just like Form 1, but it's for your match. You'll know that it's for your match because it's going to have a bright pink line on the top. Match is 20% of the total award. To calculate this, take the amount you are asking for and divide by 80% and then multiply by 20%. And that is your total match for the total award. All funds designated as match are restricted to the same uses as the subaward funds and must be expended within the grant period. Match can be non-federal, donations, or volunteers. During the pandemic, all VOCA match can be waived. If you wish to have your match waived, that's fine. Please note this on Form 3 instead of entering match sources. Declining match and requesting a waiver will not in any way affect your application process. Match funding source needs to be identified. If you're requesting a waiver, please place that information here. Requesting a waiver in no way affects your score. To save the Excel document as a PDF, select File on the upper left-hand side of the program. Then choose Save as Adobe PDF. It will be in the middle, and then the pop-up window, select Entire Workbook. Application Review. DCF staff, along with application review panel members, will review and evaluate each application based upon the GMU scoring matrix found in your application NOFO. The review process includes a technical review of applicant information, an executive summary, timetable, and budget forms. Funding decisions will be based on the following factors: review panel scores, geographic distribution of the proposed grant awards, conflicts or redundancy with other funded programs, or supplanting of existing funding. Alignment of the proposal with the allowable services listed in the Notice of Funding Opportunity, or the NOFO. Post-award. Once the review committee meets to review all VOCA applications, those applications are scored and funding decisions are made. Letters of intent to fund or denial letters will be sent out via email. Funded agencies will have an opportunity to amend their budget and scope of work based off of funding recommendations. Once the budget and scope of work are approved by the subrecipient and DCFS, the Notice of Subaward, or NOSA, is issued and signed by both parties. It is fully executed once signed by DCFS administration. Services may begin on July 1st, 2023, but cannot be reimbursed until the NOSA is executed. Quarterly reporting workbooks, requests for reimbursement workbooks, and the grant instructions and requirements will be sent via email with the executed NOSA. Subrecipients must comply with the VOCA grant through submittal of monthly financial status and requests for funds reports. These are due on the 15th of each month, even if no reimbursement is required. Performance reports. Quarterly reports are due by the 15th of the month following the end of the reporting quarter. On-site monitoring. DCFS conducts on-site monitoring to provide ongoing technical support to subrecipients. Compliance with changes to federal and state laws. Subrecipients are required to respond to and adhere to any and all new regulations and requirements. Adherence to federal civil rights obligations. Nevada 211. Subrecipients are required to add or update their agency's profile on Nevada 211's website at nevada211.org within 60 days after receiving the notification of award. Subrecipients are required to attend trainings as requested by DCFS. Thank you for taking the time to listen to this presentation today. On the screen, you will see the contact information for both myself and the Victim Service Manager, Andrea Valenzuela. If you have any questions, please reach out to either one of us, or you can email dcfsgrants@dcfs.nv.gov. If you have questions related to the application process or the NOFO in general, please email us so that we can answer them and post them on our frequently asked questions on January 17th. Thank you and have a great rest of your day.